Hey, so it's about 8 o'clock, and I'm not sure that there's anybody here right now. Oh, it looks like a couple people, maybe. That's great. So, this is our second evening of Read Aloud from the novel Rainbow's End by Werner Vinge. And I started last night, and we got a nice response. So, I thought, since I don't have a lot to do these days, I would do another evening's worth of reading. We have about 33 chapters. The novel is a little over 300 pages long. And so, just, I don't know, there might be some people in case you're joining us and you weren't here last night. Just a little bit of a background on the story. I won't go through the whole thing, but essentially, this is by Werner Vinge, and he's a former, I think maybe emeritus professor of mathematics at UC San Diego. And he is a science fiction author, award-winning science fiction author. This book won the Hugo Award the year it was published in 2006. And I read it before when I was looking at what was happening around Pokemon Go and me understanding what was happening with augmented reality. So I read it at the time and I had a bit of a sense of what it was, but there's a lot of technology that is described in this book from 2006. And because San Diego is a center for a lot of the development around sort of Qualcomm is based there. There's a lot of nanotechnology based there, biotechnology, and as well as the Navy special operations in San Diego. So he essentially, Vinge said, and I have a clip on my YouTube channel, that when someone asks, "Oh, where did you get the idea for all of this technology in your book?" He just says, I have friends who are building it, and in many respects, it's actually hard for me to keep up with them as I'm writing the book, because I'm a slow writer. And so the book is set in 2025. So that was a ways out when he initially wrote it, but not so far now. And the framing is sort of a near future dystopia where everybody has this augmented reality everybody wears, and there's two storylines. One centers on sort of the global intelligence community that's managing these sort of very high-tech sort of post-globalist biosurveillance states. Actually, the whole prologue is around the introduction of a virus that they believe is a mind control virus, or a virus that has the capacity to become a mind control virus. You've got to believe me. And then the second half of the story centers on a family, and the couple is a power couple in sort of cybersecurity, but they have a daughter, and then one of the main characters, Robert Gu, who we're going to be introduced to tonight, is someone who had suffered from Alzheimer's and then was brought back through sort of, high-tech bio-nanotechnology to be rejuvenated. But in the time that he's had all of this dementia, the world has significantly changed. And so the granddaughter is kind of bringing him along into this new world. So, I think I'll probably maybe read for an hour tonight. I'm not sure how far I'll get. But we'll start with chapter 2 and see how it goes. So this is called The Return. Robert Gu should be dead. He knew that. He truly did. He had been a long time dying. He wasn't really clear on how long. In this unending present, he could only see blurs. But that didn't matter, since Lena had turned the lights down so low that there was nothing to see. And the sounds. For a while, he had worn things in his ears, but they were devilishly complicated and always getting lost or worn out. Getting rid of them had been a blessing. What sounds remained were vague mumblings. Sometimes Lena complaining at him, pushing and poking, following him into the John for God's sake, and all he really wanted to do was go home. Lena wouldn't let him do that simple thing. If really it was Lena at all. Whoever, she wasn't very nice. I just want to go home. And this is so sad. My dad is actually suffering from Alzheimer's right now, so this is very touching for me. Okay, and yet he never did quite die. The lights were often brighter now, though blurry as ever. There were people around and voices, the high-pitched tones he remembered from home. They talked as if they expected to be understood. Things had been better before, when everything was a mumbling blur, and now he hurt all over. There were long drives to see the doctor, and afterward the pain was always worse. There was some guy who claimed to be his son and claimed that wherever he was now was home, and that sometimes they rolled him outside to feel the bright sun on his face and listen to the birds. No way was this home. Robert Goo remembered home. There had been snow on big mountains he could see from his folks' backyard, Bishop, California, USA. That was the place, and this wasn't it. But even though this wasn't home, his little sister was here. Kara Goo had been around before when things were dark and mumbling, but she'd always been just out of sight. I mean, this was different. At first, he was just aware of her high piping voice, like the wind bells his mother kept on the porch at home. And finally, one day, he was out on the patio, feeling the sunlight brighter and warmer than it had seemed in a long time. Even the blurs were sharp and colorful. And there was Kara's high little voice asking for him, Robert this, Robert that. And, Robert, would you like it if I showed you around the neighborhood? What? Robert's tongue felt all sticky and his voice was hoarse. It suddenly occurred to him that with all of the mumbling and darkness, maybe he hadn't spoken in some time. And there was something else that was even more strange. Who are you? There was a silence for a moment, as if the question were foolish or had been asked many times before. Robert, I'm Mary. I'm your grand... And he jerked his hand as much as it would move. Come closer, I can't see you. The blur moved directly in front of him into the middle of the sunlight. This was not some hint of presence behind his shoulder or in his memory. The blur became a face just inches from his own. He could see the straight black hair and the small round countenance smiling at him as if he were the greatest guy in the world. It really was his little sister. Robert reached forward and his hand was warm. Her hand was warm in his. Oh, Kara, it's so good to see you. He wasn't home, but maybe he was close. He was quiet for a moment. I'm glad to see you too, Robert. Would you like to go for a ride around the neighborhood? Yes, that would be nice. Things happened fast then. Kara did something and his chair seemed to spin around. It was dark and gloomy again. And they were inside the house and she was fussing like she always did, and this time getting him a hat. And she still teased, though, as in asking him if he needed to go to the bathroom. Robert sensed that the thug who claimed to be his son was lurking just to one side, watching it all. And then they were out. What, the front door? And onto a street? Kara stayed behind his wheelchair, or beside his wheelchair, as they strolled and rolled down an empty street lined with tall, thin trees. Palm trees. That's what they were. This wasn't Bishop. But this was Kara Goo, though on her very best behavior. Little Kara was a good kid, but she could only be good for so long. And then she would find some devilish tease and have him chasing her all over the house, or vice versa. Robert smiled to himself and wondered how long the angelic phase would last this time. Maybe she thought he was sick. He tried unsuccessfully to turn his chair. Well, maybe he was sick. See, we live on Honor Court. Over there, that's the Smithson's house. They transferred here from Guam last month. Bob thinks they're growing five. Oops, but I'm not supposed to talk about that. And the boyfriend of the base commander lives in that house by the corner. And I'm betting they'll be married by the end of the year. And there are some kids from school I don't want to talk to just now. Robert's wheelchair took an abrupt turn, and they were heading down a side street. Hey! Robert tried again to turn in his chair. Maybe those kids were friends of his. Kara was teasing after all. He slumped down in the chair. There was a smell of honey. Bushes seemed to hang low above them. The houses were gray, greenish blurs. Some tour, he groused. I can't see a damned thing. The wheelchair abruptly slowed. Really? The little wretch was all chortling. Don't worry, Robert. There's some devious twiddling that can fix your eyes. Grump. A pair of glasses would fix them, Kara. Maybe she was hiding them from him. There was something about the brightness and the dry wind that swept these streets, wherever this was. It made him wonder what he was doing tied to a wheelchair. They toured around a couple more blocks, and Kara fussed endlessly over him. Are you too warm, Robert? Maybe you don't need that blanket. The sun is going to burn your head, Robert. Let me tilt your cap down a little bit. At one point, there were no houses, and it seemed that they were on the edge of a long slope. Kara claimed they were looking off towards the mountains, but all Robert could see was a hazy line of tan and faded ochre. They were nothing like the mountains that shouldered into the sky above Bishop, California, USA. And then they were back indoors, in the house they had started from, and things were dark and gloomy as ever, the room lights swallowed up in darkness. Kara's bright voice was gone, and she was off to study for her classes, she said. No classes for Robert. The thug was feeding him. He still claimed to be Robert's son, but he was so big. And afterwards, there was some ignominious potty stop, more like a police interrogation than a trip to the can. And then Robert was left mercifully alone in the darkness. These people didn't even have television. There was just the silence and the dim and faraway electric lights. I should be sleepy. He had a vague memory of nights fighting off into nights, fading off into years of drowsing sleep that came right after dinner, and then later waking, walking through strange rooms and trying to find home and arguing with Lena. Tonight was different. He was still awake. Tonight he was thinking of things that had just happened. Maybe that was because he had made it partway home. Kara. So he hadn't found his folks' house on Crombie Street and the bedroom that looked out on the old pine tree and the little cabin he had built in its branches. But Kara was part of all of that, and she was here. And he sat for a long time, his thoughts slowly crunching forward. Across the room, a single lamp was a kind of whirlpool in the darkness, barely visible. The thug was sitting by the wall. He was talking to someone, but Robert couldn't see who. Robert ignored the guy and thought hard, and after a while he remembered something very scary. Caragoo had died in 2006, and they hadn't said a word to each other for years before that. And when she died, Kara had been 51 years old. Next section. West Fallbrook had been a handy place in the early years of the century. Busy, too, right next to Camp Pendleton. It had been the base's largest civilian community. A new generation of Marines had grown up here and prosecuted a new generation of war. Robert Gu Jr. had seen the tail end of that frenzy, arriving around the time when Chinese-American officers were welcomed back to positions of trust. Those had been high and bittersweet days. Now the town was bigger, but the Marines weren't nearly such a large part of it. Military life had become a lot more complicated. Between little bits of war, Lieutenant Colonel Gu found that West Fallbrook was a nice place to raise a daughter. I still think it's a mistake for Mary to call him Robert. Alice Gu looked up from her work. We've been over this before, dear. It's how we brought her up. We're Bob and Alice, not Ma and Pa or whatever silliness is currently approved. And Robert is Robert, not Grandpapa. Colonel Alice Gong Gu was short and round-faced, and when she wasn't deadly stressed, motherly. She had graduated numero uno from Annapolis back when being short and round-faced and motherly were definitely career minuses. She'd be a general officer by now, except that higher authority had discovered her more productive and dangerous work for her. That accounted for some of her kooky ideas. But not this one. She had insisted that Mary address her parents as if they were all just pals. Hey, Alice, I never minded that Mary calls us by our first names. There will come a time when besides loving us, the little general will also be our peer and maybe our boss. But this is just confusing, my old man. Bob jerked a thumb at where Robert Sr. sat, half slumping and staring. Play back the way Dad was acting this afternoon, a member of that bizarrely named club. The joke was that the Indo-Europeans would soon have the world surrounded. There was a time when China and the USA would not have taken that as a joke, but the world had changed, and both China and the US were relieved by the development. It left them with more time to worry about real problems. Alice's eyes flickered this way and that as she nodded an introductory laugh at some witty comment. And she walked a short distance with a couple of self-important types chattering all the while in Bahasa and Mandarin and good enough English, of which was the only English was intelligible to Bob. And then she was alone again. She leaned a little toward him and gave him a big grin. Well, that sounds like a good thing, she said. Your father has been beyond all rational discourse for how many years? And now suddenly he's engaged enough to have a good time? You should be thrilled. From here, he'll only get better. You'll have your father back. Yes. Yesterday, he'd said goodbye to the last of the in-home caregivers. Dad should improve very fast now, and the only reason he was still in a wheelchair was that the docs wanted to make sure his bone regeneration was complete before they let him loose in the neighborhood. She saw the expression on his face and cocked her head to one side. Are you chicken? He glanced at his father. The Paraguay operation was just a few weeks away, a covert op at the edge of the world. The prospect was coming to seem almost attractive. Maybe. Then let our little general do her thing and don't worry. And she turned and waved at someone beyond his vision. Oops, her image flickered out and there was only silent messaging. Alice to Bob. Silent message. Gotta go. I'm already covering for Secretary Martinez, and a local custom does not approve of time sharing. Close message. Bob sat for a moment in the quiet living room. Mary was upstairs studying, and outside the late afternoon slid into evening. A peaceful time. Back when he was a kid, this was when Dad would bring out the poetry books, and Dad and Mom and little Bobby would have a read-along. Actually, Bob felt a happy nostalgia for those evenings. He looked back at his father. Dad? No answer. Bob leaned forward and tried to shout diffidently. Dad, is there enough light for you? I can make it lots brighter. The old man shook his head distractedly. Maybe he even understood the question, but he gave no further indication. He just sat there and slumped to the side. His right hand rubbed again and again at the wrist of his left. And yet, this was a big improvement. Robert Goo Sr. had been down to 80 pounds, barely a living vegetable, when the UCSF medical school took him for their new treatment. It turned out the UCSF Alzheimer's cure worked where the years of conventional treatment had failed. Bob did a few errands on base, checked the plans for the upcoming Paraguay operation, and then sat back and just watched his father for a few minutes. I didn't always hate you. As a child, he had never hated his old man. Maybe that wasn't surprising. A kid has very little to compare to. Robert was strict and demanding on that little Bobby, had been very clear. And for even though Robert Sr. had often and loudly blamed himself for being such an easygoing parent, sometimes that seemed to contradict what Bob saw at his friends' homes. But it had never seemed mistreatment to Bob. Even when Mom left Dad, even that hadn't turned Bob against the old man. Lena Goo had taken years of subtle abuse, and she couldn't take any more, but her little Bobby had been oblivious to all of it. It wasn't till later, talking to Aunt Cara, that he realized how much worse Robert treated others than he had ever treated Bob. For Lieutenant Colonel Robert Goo Jr., this should be a joyous time. His father, one of America's most beloved poets, was returning from an extended campout in the Valley of the Shadow of Death. Bob took a long look at Robert's still relaxed features. No, if this were cinema, it would be a Western, and the title would be The Return of the SOB. Okay, so that's chapter 2. Chapter 3, A Minefield Made in Heaven. My eyeballs are fizzing! This shouldn't be painful. Do they actually hurt? No! But the light was so bright that Robert saw fiery color even in the shadows. It's all still a blur, but I haven't seen this well in... Well, he didn't know how long. Time itself had been a darkness in years. A woman spoke from right behind his shoulder. You've been on the retinal meds for about a week, Robert. Today we felt we had a working population of cells present, so we decided to turn them on. Another woman's voice. And we can cure your blurred vision even more easily. Read? Yes, doctor. This voice came from a man-shaped blur directly in front of him. The figure leaned near. Let me put this over your eyes, Robert. There'll be a little numbness. Big, gentle hand slipped glasses across Robert's face. At least this was familiar. He was getting new lenses fitted, but then his face went numb and he couldn't close his eyes. Just relax and look to the front. Relaxing was one thing, but there was no choice about looking to the front. And then, God, it was like watching a picture come up on a really slow computer. The blurs sharpening into finer and finer detail. Robert would have jerked back, but the numbness had spread to his neck and shoulders. The cell map in the right retina looks good. Let's do the left. A few more seconds passed, and there was a second miracle. The man sitting in front of him eased the glasses off Robert's head, and there was a smile on his middle-aged face. He wore a white cotton shirt, and the pocket was embroidered with blue stitching. Physician's assistant Reed Weber. I can see every thread of it. He looked over the man's shoulder. The walls of the clinic were slightly out of focus. Maybe he'd have to wear glasses out of doors. The thought set him laughing, and then he recognized the pictures on the walls. This was not a clinic. Those wall hangings were calligraphy that Lena had bought for their house in Palo Alto. Where am I? There was a fireplace. There were sliding glass doors that opened onto a lawn, not a book in sight. This was no place he had ever lived. The numbness in his shoulders was almost gone, and Robert looked around the room. The two female voices that weren't attached to anything visible, but Reed Weber wasn't the only person in sight. A heavy-set fellow on his left, arms akimbo, a broad smile on his face. Robert's look caught his, and the smile faltered. The man gave him a nod and said, Dad? Bob. It wasn't so much that memory that suddenly returned that he noticed a fact had been there all along. Bobby had grown up. I'll talk to you later, Dad. For now, I'll let you wrap things up with Dr. Aquino and her people. He nodded at the thin air by Robert's right shoulder and left the room. The thin air said, Actually, Robert, that's about all we intended to do today. You have a lot to do over the next few weeks, but it will be less chaotic if we take things one step at a time. We'll be keeping watch for any problems. Robert pretended to see something in the air. Right. See you around. He heard friendly laughter. Quite right. Reed can help with that. Reed Weber nodded, and now Robert had the feeling that he and Weber were truly alone in the room. The physician's assistant packed away the glasses and the various other pieces of loose equipment. Most were plastic boxes, prosaic throwaways for the miracles that they had made. Weber noticed his look and smiled. Just tools of the trade, my humdrum ones. It's the meds and machines that are floating around inside you that are really interesting. He stowed the last of the brick-like objects and looked up. You're a very lucky guy. Do you know that? I am in daylight now, where before it was night since forever. I wonder where Lena is. And then he thought about the other question. How do you mean? You picked all the right diseases. He laughed. Modern medicine is kind of like a minefield made in heaven. We can cure a lot of things. Alzheimer's, even though you almost missed the boat there. You and I both had Alzheimer's. I had the normal kind, cured at earliest onset. Lots of other things are just as fatal or crippling as ever. We can't do much with strokes. Some cancers can't be cured, and there are forms of osteoporosis that are as gruesome as ever. But all your major infirmities are things that we have slam dunk fixes for. Your bones are as good as a 50-year-old's now. And today we did your eyes, and in a week or so, we'll start reinforcing your peripheral nervous system. Reed laughed. You know, you're even got the skin and fat biochemistry that responds to Ven Kurosawa treatments. It's not one person in 1,000 who steps on that heavenly landmine. You're even going to look a lot younger. Next, you'll be having me play video games. Ah, Weber reached into his equipment bag and pulled out a slip of paper. Can't forget that. Robert took the paper and unfolded it all the way. It was really quite large, almost the size of fool's cap. This appeared to be a letterhead stationery, and at the top was a logo in a fancy font the words Crick's Clinic, Geriatrics Division. The rest was some kind of outline, the main categories being Microsoft Family, Great Wall Linux, and Epiphany Light. Eventually, you'll want to use Epiphany Light, but in the meantime, just touch the computer type you're most familiar with. The items listed under Microsoft Family were the brand names of Microsoft systems all the way back to the 1980s. Robert stared uncertainly. Robert, you do know about computers, right? Yes, the memory was there now that he thought about it, and he grinned. But I was always the last to get on board. I mean, I got my first PC in 2000. And that was because the rest of the English department was brutalizing him for not reading his email. Phew, okay. Well, you can imitate any of those old styles with that. Just lay it out on the flat arm of your chair, and your son has this room set to play the audio. But most places you'll have to keep your fingers touching the page if you want to hear output. Robert leaned forward to get a close view of the paper. It didn't glow. It didn't even have the glassy appearance of a computer display. It was just plain high-quality paper. Reed pointed out the outlined items. Now press the menu option that corresponds to your favorite system. Robert shrugged. Over the years, the department had upgraded through a number of systems, but, well, he pressed his finger to the line of the text that said WinME, and there was no pause, none of the boot-up delays he recalled, but suddenly a familiar and annoying musical jingle was in the air. It seemed to come from all around and not from the piece of paper. And now the page was full of color and icons, and Robert was filled with nostalgia, remembering many frustrating hours spent in front of glowing computer screens. Reed grinned. A good choice. WinME has been a simple rental for a long time. If you picked Epiphany, we'd be whacking through their licensing jungle. Okay, so now the rest should be almost exactly what you know. Cricket's Clinic even has some of the modern services filtered down so that they look like browser sites. This isn't quite as good as what your son and I use, but you won't have any more trouble with invisible voices, and you'll see Rachel and Dr. Aquino on the page here if you want. Be cool, Robert. Robert listened to Weber's mix of probably dated slang and tech talk, to the joviality and the phrase structures that might suggest sarcasm. Once upon a time, all that would have been enough for Robert to calibrate this fellow. But today, just out of the murk of senility, he couldn't be sure. So he probed a little. Am I all young again? Reed sat back and gave an easy laugh. Wish I could tell you that, Robert. I mean, you're 75 years old, and there are a lot more ways for the body to break down than the MDs have ever imagined. But I've been on your case for 6 months. You've come back from the dead, man. You almost got the Alzheimer's licked. It made sense to try these other treatments you're on now, and you're going to have some surprises, mostly for the good. Just take it easy. Roll with the punches. For instance, I noticed you recognized your son just now. Yeah. Yes? Well, I was here just a week ago, and you didn't recognize him then. It was strange to poke into that dimness, but yes, I knew I couldn't have a son. I wasn't old enough. I just wanted to go home. I mean, to my parents' home in Bishop. And even now, I'm kind of surprised to see that Bob is so old. Consequences were crashing down upon him. So my parents are dead? Reed nodded. I'm afraid so, Robert. There's a whole lifetime that you're going to start remembering. As a patchwork, or oldest memories first, or maybe I get stuck at some point? The MDs can give you the best answers on that. Reed hesitated. Look, Robert, you used to be a professor, right? I was a poet. But he didn't think Reed would appreciate the more valued rank. Yes, professor. Well, Professor Emeritus of English at Stanford. Okay, then, you were a smart guy. You have a lot to learn, but I'm betting you'll get those smarts back. Now, don't panic if you can't remember something. Don't push too hard. Practically every day, the docs are going to restore something, some additional capacity, some additional capability. The theory is that this will be less disturbing for you. And whether that's right or wrong, it won't matter if you keep cool. Remember, you have a whole loving family here. Lena. Robert lowered his head for a moment. Not a return to childhood, but kind of a second chance. If If he could come all the way back from Alzheimer's, well, then he might have another 20 years left, time to make up for what he'd lost. So 2 goals, his poetry and Lena. Reed leaned closer. What did you say, sir? Robert looked up. My ex-wife. He tried to remember more. I bet I'll never remember what happened to her after I lost my marbles. Like I said, don't worry about it. I remember being married to Lena and raising Bobby, and we split up years ago, but then I remember her being with me when I had the Alzheimer's and really started to shut me down, and now she's gone again. Where is she, Reed? Reed frowned and then leaned forward and zipped up his equipment case. I'm sorry, Robert. She passed away 2 years ago. He stood and gave Robert a gentle pat on the shoulder. You know, I think we've made real good progress today. Now I gotta run. Next section. In his former life, Robert Gu had paid even less attention to technology than he had to current events. Human nature doesn't change, and as a poet, his job was to distill and display that unchanging essence. Now, well, I'm back from the dead. That was something new under the sun, a bit of technology somewhat too large to ignore. And it was a new chance at life, a chance to continue his career. And where he should continue his art was obvious, was with Secret of the Ages. He had spent 5 years on the cantos of that sequence. Poems such as Secrets of the Child, Secrets of the Young Lovers, Secrets of the Old. But his Secrets of the Dying had been an errant fake, written before he actually started to die. No matter that people seemed to think it was the most profound canto of the sequence. But now, well, something new, Secrets of the One Who Came Back. The ideas were coming, and surely verse would follow. Every day, there were new changes in himself, and old barriers suddenly removed. He could easily accept Reed Weber's advice to be patient with his limitations. So much was changing, and all for the better. And one day he's walking again, and even if it was lurching unstable gait. He fell 3 times that first day, and each time he just bounced back to his feet. Unless you fall on your head, Professor, you will be fine, Reed said. But his walking got steadily better, and now he could see, really see. And he could do things with his hands. No more pawing around in the dark. He'd never realized how important sight was to coordination. And there are unaccountable ways that things can lie and tangle and hide in 3 dimensions. Without vision, you're condemned to compromise and failure. But not me, not now. And 2 days after that, he was playing ping pong with his granddaughter, and he remembered the table, and it was the one he'd bought for little Bobby 30 years ago, and he even remembered Bob taking it off his hands when he finally gave up his home in Palo Alto. And today, Mary was pulling her punches, lobbing the ball high and slow across the table, and Robert moved back and forth. Seeing the ball was no problem, but he had to be very careful or he would swing too high. Careful, careful went the game until Mary had him down 15-11, and then he won 5 points each stroke with a kind of spastic twitch that somehow smashed the white plastic into the far edge of the table. Robert, you are just fooling me. Poor pudgy Mary raced from one corner of the table to the other, trying to keep up with him. Robert's slams had no spin, but she wasn't an expert player. 17-15, 18-19, and then his powerful swings got out of tune, and he was back to being a staggering spastic. But now his granddaughter showed no mercy. She racked up 6 straight points and won the game. And then she ran around the table to hug him. You're great, but you'll never fool me again. It didn't do any good to tell her what Aquino had said, that the reconstruction of his nervous system would cause randomly spiky performance. He might end up with the reflexes of an athlete, or more likely the endpoint would be something like average coordination. Next section. It was funny how he paid attention to the day of the week. That had stopped mattering even before he lost his marbles, but now on the weekends, his granddaughter was around all day. What was Great Aunt Carol like? She asked him one Saturday morning. Well, she was a lot like you, Mary. The girl's smile was sudden and wide and proud. Robert had guessed that this was what she wanted to hear. But it's true, except that Kara was never overweight. Mary was like Kara, right in those last years of pre-adolescence when her hero worship for her older brother had been replaced by other concerns. If anything, Mary's personality was an exaggeration of Kara's. Mary was very bright, probably smarter than her great aunt, and Mary was already into extreme independence and moral certainty of the other. I remember that persistent arrogance, thought Robert. That had been an enormous irritation. Breaking her of it had been what drove them apart. Sometimes Mary had her little friends over. The boys and girls mixed pretty indiscriminately at that age in that era, and for a brief few years they were almost matched muscle for muscle. Mary loved to play doubles at ping pong. You had to smile at the way she bossed her friends around. She had them organized into a tournament, and although she was scrupulously honest, she played to win. And when her side got behind, her jaw set in an angry determination, and there was steel in her eyes. And afterwards, she was quick to acknowledge her own failures and just as quick to critique her playmates. Even when her friends were gone physically, they were often still around, invisible presences like Robert's doctors. Mary walked around the backyard talking and arguing with nobody, a parody of all the cell phone discourtesy that Robert remembered from his later years at Stanford. And then there were Mary's grand silences. Those didn't match anything in his recollection of Kara. Mary would push gently back and forth on the swing that hung from the only good-sized tree in the backyard. She would do that for hours, speaking only occasionally, and then to the empty air. Her eyes seemed to be focused miles away, and when he asked her what she was doing, she would start and laugh and say she was studying. It looked much more like some sort of pernicious hypnosis to Robert Goo. Weekdays, Mary was off at school. A limo pulled up for her every morning, always at the moment that the girl was ready to go. Bob was gone nowadays, to be back in a week or so. Alice was home part of each day, but she was in a distinctly short-tempered mood. And sometimes he would see her at lunch. More often, his daughter-in-law was at Camp Pendleton until mid-afternoon. She was especially irritable when she came back from the base. Except for Reed Weber's therapy sessions, Robert was pretty much left to his own devices. He wandered around the house. He found some old books in cardboard boxes in the basement. Now, those were almost the only books in the house. The family was effectively illiterate. Sure, Mary bragged that many books were visible at any time you wanted to see them, but that was a half-truth. The browser paper that Reed had given him could be used to find books online, but reading them on that single piece of foolscap was a tedious desecration. It was remarkable foolscap, though. It really did support teleconferencing. Dr. Aquino and the remote therapists were not just invisible voices anymore, and the web browser was much like the ones he remembered, even though many sites couldn't be displayed properly. Google still worked. He searched for Lena Llewellyn-Goo, and of course, there was plenty of information about her. Lena had been a medical doctor and rather well known in a limited humdrum sort of way, and yes, she had died a couple of years ago. The details were a cloud of contradiction, some agreeing with what Bob told him, some not. It was this damn friends of privacy. It was hard to imagine such villains doing their best to undermine what you could find on the net. A vandal charity was what they called themselves. And that eventually got him into the news of the day. The world was as much a mess as ever before. This month, it was police action in Paraguay. The details didn't make sense. What were moonshine fabs, and why would the U.S. want to help local cops close them down? The big picture was more familiar. The invading forces were looking for weapons of mass destruction. Today, they found nuclear weapons hidden beneath an orphanage. The pictures showed slums and poor people, ragged children playing inscrutable games that somehow seemed to deny all the squalor around. And there was an occasional, almost lonely-looking soldier. I'll bet this is where Bob is, he thought. Not for the first time, or the thousandth. He wondered how his son could have chosen such an ugly, dead-end career. Next section. Evenings, they had something like a family meal. Alice and Robert and Mary. Now, Alice seemed happy to do the cooking, though tonight she looked like she hadn't slept in a couple days. Robert hung around the kitchen watching mother and daughter slide trays from the fridge. TV dinners, that's what we used to call this sort of thing, he said. In fact, this stuff had the appearance and texture of delicious food. It all tasted like mush to him, but Reed said that was because his taste buds were 95% dead. Mary hesitated the way she often did when Robert tossed out some idea she hadn't heard before. But as usual, her response was full of confidence. Oh, these are much better than TV junk food. We can mix and match the parts. She pointed at the unmarked containers sizzling in, well, it looked like a microwave. See, I got the ice cream dessert, and Alice got angel hair blueberries. Wow, Alice. Alice gave her a brief smile. I'll share. Okay, let's get into this into the dining room. It took all three of them to carry everything, but no second trip was needed. They set the food on the long dining table, and the tablecloth was an intricate damask that seemed to be different every night. The table itself was familiar, another hand-me-down. Lena's presence was still everywhere. Robert sat down beside Mary. You know, he said, more to probe reactions than anything else, this all seems a bit primitive to me. I mean, where are the robot servants or even the little automatic hands to put the TV dinners in the wave and take them out? His daughter-in-law gave an irritated shrug. Well, where it makes sense, we have robots. Robert remembered Alice Gong when she had married Bob. Back then, Alice had been an impenetrable diplomat, so smooth that most people never realized her skill. In those days, he still had his edge, both with verse and with people, and he took such a personality as a challenge. And yet his former self had never been able to find a chink in her armor. The new Alice only imitated the composure of the old one, and with varying success. Tonight was not one of her better nights. Robert remembered the news about Paraguay and took a stab in the dark. Are you worried about Bob? She gave him an odd smile. No, Bob is fine. Mary glanced at her mother and then chirped. Actually, if you want to know, Mex, you should see my doll collection. Mex? Dolls? It was hard to dominate people when you didn't know what they were talking about. He backed up. I mean, they're all the things that future freaks have been predicting for 100 years that never happened. Things like air cars. Well, Mary looked up from her steaming food, and at one corner of the tray, there really was a bowl of ice cream. Well, we have air taxis. Does that count? Well, that gets partial credit. And then he surprised himself. When can I see one? The Robert of old would have dismissed mechanical contrivances as beneath any mature interest. Anytime. How about after dinner? This last question was directed at Alice as much as Robert. That brought back a more natural smile to Alice's face. Maybe this weekend. They ate in silence for a moment. I wish I could taste this stuff. And then Alice was on to the topic she must have been saving up. You know, Robert, I've been looking at all of the medics' reports on you, and you're almost up to speed now. Have you considered resuming your career? Why, of course, I'm thinking about it all the time. I've got new writing ideas. He gestured expansively and was surprised by the fear that suddenly rose in him. Hey, don't worry, Alice. I've got my writing. I've got my job offers from schools all around the country. I'll be out of your way as soon as I get my feet solidly off the ground. Mary said, Oh, no, Robert, you can stay with us. We like having you here. But at this point, don't you think you should be actively reaching out? Said Alice. Robert looked back mildly. How's that? Well, you know that Reed Weber's last session with you is next Tuesday, and I bet there are still new skills you'd like to master. Have you considered taking classes? Fairmont High has a number of special... Colonel Alice was doing pretty well, but she was handicapped by the 13-year-old at Robert's side. Mary piped up with Yeko. Yeko, that's our vocational track. A few old people and a lot of teenage dumbleheads. It's dull, dull, dull. Mary, there are basic skills. Reed Weber has done a lot of that, and I can teach Robert to wear. And she patted his arm. Don't worry, Robert. Once you learn to wear, you can learn anything. Now, right now, you're in a trap. It's like you're seeing the world through that little hole. Just whatever your naked eye sees and what you can get from that. And she pointed at the magic fool's cap that was tucked under his shirt pocket. With some practice, you should be able to see and hear as good as anyone. Alice shook her head. Mary, there are lots of people who don't use contacts and wearables. Yes, but they're not my grandfather. And that was that defiant little thrust of the jaw. Robert, you should be wearing. You look silly walking around with that view page clutched in your hand. Alice seemed about to object more forcefully and then settled back, watching Miri with the neutral gaze that Robert couldn't fathom. Miri didn't seem to notice the look. She leaned her head forward and stuck a finger close in her right eye. You already know about contacts, right? Want to see one? Her hand came away from her eye. A tiny disc sat on the tip of her middle finger. It was the size and shape of the contact lenses he had known. He hadn't expected anything more, but he bent down close and looked, and after a moment he realized that it was not quite a clear lens. Speckles of colored brightness swirled and gathered on it. I'm driving it at safety max, or you wouldn't see the lights. The tiny lens became hazy and then frosty white. It powered down. But you get the idea. And she popped it back in her eye and grinned at him. And now her right eye was fogged with an enormous cataract. You should get a fresh one, dear, said Alice. Oh, no, said Miri. Once it warms up, it'll be good for the rest of the day. And, in fact, the cataract was fading. Miri's dark brown iris showing through. So what do you think, Robert? That it's a rather gross substitute for what I can do simply by reading my view page? That's all there is to it? No. I mean, we can fix you up with one of Bob's shirts and a box of contacts right away. It's learning to use them that's the trick. Colonel Alice said, without some control, it's like old-time television, but much more intrusive. We wouldn't want you to be hijacked, Robert. How about this? I'll get you some trainer clothes and that box of contacts that Miri mentioned. And in the meantime, give some thought about attending Fairmont High, okay? Miri leaned forward and grinned at her mother. Betcha he's wearing inside of a week. You won't need those loser classes. And Robert smiled benignly over Miri's head. Next section. In fact, there had been job offers. His return had percolated onto the web, and 12 schools had written him, but 5 were simply speaking invitations. 3 were for semester artist-in-residence gigs, and the others weren't from first-ranked schools. It was not exactly the welcome Robert expected from one of the century's literary giants, quoting the critics here. They're afraid I'm still a vegetable. So Robert kept the offers on ice and worked on his writing. He would show the doubters he was sharp as ever, and in the doing, he would overleap them to the sort of recognition he deserved. But progress was slow on the poetry front. Progress was slow on a lot of fronts. His face actually looked young now. Reed said such complete cosmetic success was rare, that Robert was a perfect target for the then Kurosawa process. Wonderful. But his coordination remained spastic and his joints ached all the time. Most ignominious. He still had to hike down to the John several times each night to take a leak. That was surely the fates reminding him he was still an old man. Yesterday, he had been Weber's last visit. The guy had a menial mind, but it was exactly matched to the menial aid he provided. I'll miss him, I suppose. Not the least, because now there was another empty hour in every day. And progress was especially slow on the poetry front. For Robert, dreams had never been an important source of inspiration, though he had claimed otherwise in several well-known interviews. But wide-awake attempts at creativity were the last resort of pedestrian minds. For Robert Goo, real creativity most often came after a good night's sleep, just as he roused himself to wakefulness. That moment was such a reliable source of inspiration that when he was having problems with writing, he would often go the pedestrian route in the evening, stock up his mind with the intransigencies of the moment, and then the next morning, drowsing, review what he knew. And then in this labile freshness of new consciousness, answers would drift into view. In his years at Stanford, he'd run the phenomenon past philosophers, religionists, and the hardcore science people. And they'd had 100 explanations from Freudian psychology to quantum physics. The explanation didn't matter. Sleeping on it worked for him. And now, coming out of years of dementia, he still had that morning edge, but his control of the process was as erratic as ever. Some mornings his mind was awash with ideas for the secrets of the one who came back, and his revision of the secrets of dying. And yet none of these mornings' brainstorms contained poetical detail. He had the ideas, he had the concepts down to the level of verse blocks, but he didn't have the words and the phrases that made the ideas into beauty. Maybe that was okay. For now, after all, making words sing was the highest, purest talent. Didn't it make sense that such would be his very last talent to return? In the meantime, many of his mornings were wasted on garbage insights. His subconscious had turned traitor, fascinated by how things worked, by technology and math. And during the day, when he was surfing his view page, he was constantly diverted by topics unrelated to any artistic concern. He had spent one whole afternoon on a child's introduction to finite geometry, for goodness sakes. And the big insight he wakened with the next morning had been a proof of one of the harder exercises. Robert's daytime was a grinding bore, an endless search for the right words, all the while trying to ignore the lure of his view page. His evenings were spent putting off Mary and her attempts to stick foreign objects onto his eyeballs. Finally, morning insight came to his rescue. Rising toward wakefulness, thinking dispassionately about his failure, he noticed the green junipers beyond his window, the yard painted in soft pastels, and there was a world outside. There were a million different viewpoints there. What had he done in the past when progress hit roadblocks? You take a break. You do something different, almost anything. Going back to high school would get him out of this, get Mary out of his hair, and it would certainly expose him to different, even if narrow, viewpoints. Alice would be so pleased. So that's chapter 2 and 3, and I guess that'll be it for this round. So anyway, thanks you guys for joining in. I hope, I don't know, like I said, it seems kind of old-fashioned and it seems weird just to do this online, but strange times, right? So anyway, good night, everybody. Have a good rest of your weekend.